Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Smith. I'm the Director of Library and Archives at the York County History Center. This program is being recorded and will be available on the York County History Center's YouTube channel. If you have any questions during the program, please type them in the chat or comments on Facebook, and we will address them after the program. Last year, the York County History Center republished the memoir by Daisy Myers entitled Sticks and Stones, The Myers Family in Levittown. This second edition features a foreword by Michael Newsom, the Secretary of Pennsylvania Office of Administration, and a new afterword by Daisy's daughter, Lynda Myers. This book is now available for sale at the York County History Center store. You can purchase it online if you visit our website, yorkhistorycenter.org. We are also donating copies of the book, the new edition, to public and school libraries around York County. We asked Dr. Peter Levy to speak tonight about the Myers family story. We're also very happy to have Daisy Myers' daughter, Lynda Myers, here this evening. And we'll be joining Dr. Levy after his program. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter B. Levy. He is a professor in the Department of History and Political Science at York College of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on recent America, the Civil Rights Movement, and race and justice. His most recent book, The Great Uprising, Race Riots in Urban America During the 1960s, was published in 2018 and contains a detailed discussion of York's 1969 race revolt, including the history of housing discrimination, which contributed to its outbreak. Thank you, Dr. Levy, for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Let me try to do that little logistical stuff of sharing the screen. I hope I get it right. It says, Nicole, I can't share while you're sharing yours. Okay, looks like I can get to it now.
I will work it. Oh, there you go.
Okay, good. And then blow it up. And just to do one last little thing here so I can read it out. Good. So I have to shrink the two of you. Sorry about that. Don't mean. So let me begin by thanking the York History Center for inviting me to make a presentation today. And I see the closed captioning is working. We can't seem to get rid of that. To commemorate the publication of the new edition of Daisy Myers' memoir, Sticks and Stones. I also want to thank Lynda Myers for agreeing to join the webinar. About 4 years ago, Lynda, myself, and two others participated in a discussion on housing in York, which began with a discussion of the Myers family desegregation of Levittown. And it was really a wonderful event. So I was overjoyed when Nicole reached out to me to do this again. I titled tonight's presentation, York's Rosa Parks, Daisy Myers and the Quest for the American Dream, because I, like many other scholars and journalists, view Daisy Myers as one of the true heroes of the struggle for racial equality. And if you don't believe me, just read her book. My talk will be broken into three parts. First, I will provide a brief synopsis of Myers' memoir, focusing on the first chapter. Second, I'll discuss why the Myers family's fight to desegregate Levittown is crucial to our understanding of the broader struggle for racial equality, both in the 1950s and today. And finally, I'm going to consider why Myers' story is not well known and the relationship between what's often termed as silence and the current fight over the teaching of race in our schools. I hope to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for questions for me and Ms. Myers. Hang on. Oh, I get it. I see what's going on. Sorry. So I'm not going to discuss all of Sticks and Stones. After all, we want you to buy the book. However, I will provide a discussion, a more richer discussion of the first chapter, which is entitled Moving Day, because in it, Daisy Myers set the tone for the rest of her work and lays out her fundamental argument. The Myers family, which consisted of Bill, a York native, Daisy, who was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and their three children, William, Age 4, Stephen, age 3, and the newborn baby girl, Lynda, moved into their new 3-bedroom ranch house at 43 Deep Green Lane on August 13th, 1957. They moved from nearby Bloomsdale because, as Daisy Myers put it in her memoir, they, quote, needed a bigger place. As Myers explains in chapter 1, they knew that the Levitts had planned their model suburb, these are the Levitts, as a lily white, or really an all white community. They also knew that the NAACP had recently lost a lawsuit which had sought to compel the Levitts to drop the color bar, the color line. They also knew that they might face some opposition to become the community's first Negro family, a title given to them by the local newspaper the day they moved in. However, as Daisy Myers wrote, they believed, quote, any American was free to purchase any home anywhere if he could pay the purchase price, end quote, which the Myers were able to do. Since both Bill and Daisy were well educated, since Bill was a World War II veteran, since Daisy and Bill had befriended and worked with a fairly large number of Levittowners, even before they moved into their home on Deep Green Lane, they did not expect white opposition to be as fierce as it was. Or as Myers reflected, something was missing in our mental gymnastics. We didn't fully take into account the prejudices of so many Americans. Less than a couple hours after they arrived, the mailman came to the front door, and asked to speak to the owner. When Daisy Myers um, replied that she was the owner, the mailman, writes Myers, quote, stepped back. The look on his face was one of fright, as if he had seen a ghost. He stuttered, you are the owner? That's right, Daisy replied. With a limp hand, he handed me the letter and left. Myers later spotted the same mailman in the crowd that was assembled in front of their house to protest the Myers' presence. Shortly thereafter, Daisy answered a telephone call to hear one lady, quote, frantically declare, I will not let my children drink chocolate milk again as long as I live, end quote. By 4:30, Myers writes, trouble began to brew. Crowds gathered nearby, and cars crept by, bumper to bumper, with drivers screeching to a halt to stare at their house with drivers driving by screeching to stare at their house. Sorry. As night approached, one drunk intruder, to borrow Myers' word, demanded to know who had sold them the house and what right they had to move into their community. With tempers increasing, the Myers called the local and Pennsylvania state police. The state police said this was a local matter, and that everything, but the local police replied that everything was being taken care of. However, as Myers continued, it wasn't. As the sun began to set, two middle-aged men who clearly had been drinking approached the front door and began, quote, talking of burning, dynamiting, and blasting them to bits. The police finally arrived and began to issue parking tickets. Having left their beds in their Bloomsdale home and fearing for their safety, the Myers left for the night, with Daisy Myers wondering if this would be, quote, her children's earliest remembered experience. In addition to wondering if they could or should persevere, Myers concludes her first chapter with these powerful words, which I will quote at length. Why were the crowds at our home? Are we different from the average family that moved to Levittown? Are we immune to the yearning for a little suburban home with green grass and flowers all around? Do we love our children less than they do? Are we sick and tired of ghettos? Do we have the right to choose a neighborhood, or do the neighbors have a right to choose us? Have they come to tell us where we shall or shall not live? Aren't we human? To the mob, we are not. What hope could we have that their distorted values would change? And was it our responsibility to bring about the conversion? I didn't think so. I was more concerned with the responsibilities a mother feels for those she loves and those who love her. Did we not, I asked myself, as an American Negro family, have a legal and moral right to live in a place of our choosing? What are the American ideals of justice and equality? As I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to quieter times. In the rest of her book, Myers details the obstacles she and her family had to overcome in order to own a piece of the American dream. This part of the book is well worth reading. Suffice it to say, things got worse before they got better. Spearheaded by the euphemistically named Levittown Betterment Association, a substantial number of white Levittowners and outsiders organized large protests and promoted boycotts of businesses and associations who failed to close ranks, such as a local oil dealer who had helped the Myers heat their own home. Along with the KKK, the Betterment Association played to white Levittowners' worst fears, claiming that if black families moved in, crime would rise, property values would fall, and that white women and girls would fall prey to hypersex black men. In addition to detailing the burning of a cross on the lawn of her supportive next door neighbors, Myers reserved some of her most telling criticism for white moderates, including church leaders and religious institutions, who championed civility or law and order over civil rights, writing, "We never received widespread community support from the silent sympathizers whose influence could have spurred authorities to have acted more proactively. Their default gave the impression that the masses of Levittowners were behind the actions of the Betterment Group." Such a statement presaged the opening remarks of Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, which sharply criticized moderates who preached that blacks should wait. At the same time, Myers praised those who risked much in order to support integration, especially local Quakers and Jewish organizations, and she gave credit to people from afar who boosted her morale by writing moving letters in support. One family who sided with the Myers was the Von Blooms, including Paul Von Bloom, who was 14 at the time. In his own memoir, A Life at the Margin, Paul recalls how he and his family were ostracized by townspeople who asserted they must be communist or race traitors. The local high school principal blocked Paul from enrolling in the high school when he was a first year student there. After white mobs injured a police officer, however, Governor George Leader, a York native, sent in the state police and implemented a temporary injunction against the crowds demonstrating at the Myers home. This temporary injunction was ultimately made permanent via a lawsuit supported by the state. And by the time that the spring of 1958 came around, the Myers had settled in, and most, though not never all, of the organized opposition to them dissipated. This said, as suggested above, many who stood with the Myers paid a price, including support of religious leaders whose flocks fled rather than abide by their belief in the brotherhood of all men. In 1962, the Myers moved to central Pennsylvania, first to Harrisburg, then back to York, and then Dallastown, where Lynda grew up and where Daisy and Bill worked. Shortly after they moved, Daisy wrote what would become Sticks and Stones, but did she not finalize the work for decades? Turning from the Myers story to the larger theme of residential segregation, let me quote historian Thomas Sugrue, who in his essay Jim Crow's Last Stand, The Struggle to Integrate Levittown, argues that nothing symbolized the promise of post-war America more than Levittown. Affordable housing for the common man, its mass-produced houses remade the American landscape after World War II. Immediately attracted a heterogeneous mix of suburbanites, blue-collar workers employed in the nearby U.S. Steel plant, teachers, clerks, and administrators. Yet from the get-go, Levittown was off limits to blacks, not, as Sugo adds, because of the shortage of buyers. Between 1946 and 1953, only 347 out of 120,000 new homes built in the area were available to blacks due to exclusionary policies such as those practiced by the Levitts, which resulted in black families paying more for housing on average than white ones did. Levitt, who was Jewish, justified his racial exclusionary policies thusly, stating, "We can solve the housing problem or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two." And Levitt was hardly alone in holding these views. During the Great Depression, the federal government established housing policies that aimed to make homes affordable to the common man for the first time in U.S. history. On one level, these were among the most successful programs of the entire New Deal, leading to a double of homeownership rates in a bit over a generation. Yet these same policies, through a practice known as redlining, and this is a map of redlining in Philadelphia, which restricted loans and home insurance to white neighborhoods, reinforced patterns of residential segregation that already existed due to other racially discriminatory practices, such as racial covenants, and restrictive steering by real estate agents, something Daisy Myers mentions in one of her chapters in the book Existed in York. The dual housing market, one white and one black, has had a deep and lasting impact. As Robert Weaver, the first black cabinet member, put it, the housing problem and the racial problem were utterly inseparable or intertwined. Where you lived shaped your educational opportunities, your access to jobs, your quality of life. Real estate became the most important vehicle for the accumulation of wealth. Or as Sugrue puts it, there was no right more fundamental than equal access to housing. But time and again, white Americans and the officials they elected did not support this right. The impact of America's discriminatory housing policies, ranging from those that incentivize developers to build all white communities to those that simply refuse to outlaw blatant racial discrimination until 1968, are still felt today. While Daisy Myers and her family won the right to live in the home they purchased in Levittown, in many ways their victory was the exception that proved the rule. Public polls suggested that over time, the support for racial integration grew, but the public's actual behavior changed little. Put somewhat differently, white Americans learned how to talk the talk, but they did not walk the walk. As late as 2000, only about 2% of Levittown's residents were blacks. We could spend an entire panel discussing why this was the case, though Myers offers some keen insight, writing, "We realized years ago to our sorrow that the housing market, above all else, stands as a symbol of racial inequality. What a tragedy that so many people of minority races are forced to stay within the walls of the Black Belt. Negroes recognize these years as an opportunity. Negroes recognize these years as an opportunity to wipe out racial injustices of 100 years. There will be continued unrest until Negroes are given complete freedom and treated as first-class citizens." For the millions of Black Americans who proved unable to purchase a home in the suburbs or in the better sections of Philadelphia, Trenton, or hundreds of other cities, we can measure the cost in dollars and cents. Imagine, for instance, if the Myers had stayed in their three-bedroom rancher. Today, that same home, which they purchased for around $12,000, would be worth about $243,000, which is more than 3 times the rate of inflation. Those assets could be used to garner loans for higher education, to start a small business, to hand down to one's children or grandchildren, to put away for a COVID storm, even to purchase a second home. But most Black families were denied the ability to buy those homes in the first place. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in a Montgomery bus in December of 1955, and Daisy Myers and her family's decision to purchase a home in Levittown 2 years later and then stay there in the face of fierce resistance, represent two sides of the same coin. Both women were pioneers in the struggle for human rights, which we call the Civil Rights Movement. Yet, whereas Parks is one of the best and known and most revered figures in American history, Myers remains at best a footnote. There are multiple reasons for this, but let me mention just a few of them. First, we tend to think of race as a Southern problem, locating Jim Crow or segregation in the South, not in the North. For years, scholars, journalists, lawyers, and political leaders reinforced this view by asserting that segregation was de jure, or legal, in the South, but de facto in the North, meaning blacks and whites went to separate schools because of segregation laws in the South, but because they chose to live amongst their own in the North. Daisy Myers' story proves this was not the case. Second, contemporary media coverage made things worse. The media did cover the crisis in Levittown, but the media paid far greater attention to Southern crises, such as the school desegregation crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, which took place almost simultaneously with the crisis in Levittown. Even today, if I were to do a search of most major newspapers, you'll find that the Levittown crisis, if it got coverage, rarely made the headlines in the major newspapers, while Little Rock got major headlines, particularly when the president decided to send in federal troops to Little Rock. Certainly didn't send them in to Levittown. In this turn, this has left historians or people like us with fewer records to build on. Or as scholar Michael Trudeau notes, the first silencing of the past comes with a decision over what to report on and what to put in archives in the first place. Finally, in recent years, hundreds of memorials and monuments related to the civil rights movement have been built, but almost all of them are in the South. And when historians and journalists seek to overcome this gap of the public's memory, say by discussing the systems that created residential discrimination in the first place, they are silenced. For instance, less than a year ago, protests erupted at Central York High School due to the school board's decision to promote policies that restricted what could and could not be taught about race in the schools. As you may know, these students, joined by a broad coalition, fought back and won at least a temporary overturning of these policies. But nationwide, the movement to ban what's called critical race theory, or the teaching of the 1619 Project, or to educate students about systematic racism, such as redlining, has erupted like a prairie fire. Though it's a prairie fire that's actually very well funded by big donors who seek to use this as the newest wedge issue in the long-standing culture wars. Proponents of banning the teaching of CRT contend they aren't racist, but rather believe in the rights of the majority, arguing that parents should have the right to decide what their children are taught in school. Such discourse parallels the arguments made by those who oppose the Myers. Writes James Wolfinger in his article, The American Dream for All Americans, Race and Politics, and the Campaign to Desegregate Levittown, protesters, quote, paraded with the flag in front of the Myers house, chanting, "This is America, this is America," and asserted that they had the right to determine who could live in their neighborhood and who couldn't. When one commissioner defended the right of the Myers to live in Levittown, white residents resorted that democracy means majority rule. And that meant that whites could deny equal opportunities to African Americans and that blacks were at fault for upsetting the status quo or discomforting them. Put somewhat differently, if we feel that the Daisy Myers story is one that should be told, one that we value, one that we believe, one that we recognize, one that recognizes that there are powerful forces who want to maintain and silence teaching about her story, because to do so properly demands we discuss how residential segregation came into being in the first place, how it was maintained, and the impact that housing discrimination continues to have on society today. Thank you. I think I kept well within my 20 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. And hopefully there are for both Lynda and myself, because I'm going to ask Lynda questions if the audience doesn't. So.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions at this point?
And I'll stop my share too. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Nothing yet, Dr. Levy, if you want to keep going.
Well, I'm going to ask Lynda then, just your memories, not as a little child, but more of what your parents, because it wasn't just your mother, it was your whole family that lived through that. What type of stories and when she started sharing these, or did she try to protect you and not tell you stories about this?
Actually, that's more online what happened. My father and mother never really told us anything about this Levittown story. And we were all really too young to remember what happened. And it wasn't until actually she retired from everything that she felt she was free to tell the story and not suffer any kind of consequences. That she always thought she would suffer consequences if people knew who she was. So she kept this very quiet. And when she finally decided to publish the book is when she really started talking about what happened and her feelings.
Dr. Levy, you're on mute.
I do see one question, which is a good one, which is what was Daisy's explanation for the family's decision to leave Levittown? So as I understood it, the decision to move to Levittown was motivated in part by Lynda's father was working in the area and the family increased in size. And so they looked for a house and got a house at Levittown. But then other job opportunities opened up first in Harrisburg and then later on in York. Now, at least that's her explanation in the book, whether she felt more welcome back in York. Now, Lynda's father was from York in the first place, so that may have also contributed to it. And even in the book, they had other family back in York as well. I'm pretty sure about that, but Lynda can
Mhm.
doc
Yes.
confirm that.
Well, actually, my mother, I believe, was working in New York at this time because I remember her leaving like for days and coming back. So she was commuting back and forth. So that was another reason they decided to move to Harrisburg because she was teaching in New York.
And that's interesting because that's not in the book. In the book, I think she talks about how your father, Frank, got a job in the state first and then down in York. And she resumed her teaching and then administrative career. Watched the movie Suburbicon last evening, wondering how accurate the depiction of the Myers family is. So 4 years ago when we met, I think, or 4 or 5 years ago, it was the film that kind of led to the discussion. I mean, I think the trouble with Suburbicon is, the Myers family crisis seems to be kind of a backdrop for a crazy crime story. I wish they hadn't done that. But my sense of the tension that existed, that those scenes look very accurate. I mean, in fact, there are websites that have extensive photographs. I think Temple University has about 50 photographs, at least, that were culled and probably other newspapers. But from what I sense, the crowds that were gathering, the danger, the threats, that all seems quite accurate. The crime scene, I think, is something that they made up to. I don't know why they made it up. That's. I wish they had just talked about the Myers story. It would have been a better movie. Lynda, do you have a sense of?
But yes, only I would agree with you. Only those scenes where they're showing disruption and chaos is what actually happened. The family size wasn't the same. I mean, yeah, that was about basically it.
And I see one other comment here, which, I can give a response to say, all you need to do is look at the TV ads for governor. Yeah, unfortunately, I teach in York, but I live in Maryland, so I don't always see these ads, but I kind of know what what the code words are, if they're code words at all. And to me, what's really important to think about is the degree to which racism persists for multiple reasons. But one of the reasons is because we are so socially, we're so spatially segregated still. We live pretty much still in these social spaces, so that the those social spaces just breed the continuation of ignorance. So, for example, when the Myers arrive in Levittown, the whites making the argument, well, this will lead to crime, this will lead to declining property values, this will lead to sexual assaults and all this stuff. I think those views are still played on because we are more desegregated than we were in 1950, but I think what stands out to me is how socially segregated we still are. I mean, I don't want to get in too much trouble, but I think, one way to think about that is, say students coming to York who aren't from York, and they're going to bring with them certain attitudes. And one of their attitudes is, I don't go to downtown York. They rather than seeing it as a city of opportunity to expand their horizons. And so, they bring with them their preconceived knowledges because they largely come from segregated spaces. And to me, that's why I read Daisy Meyer's comment in her book about there was this opportunity in the 50s and 60s to create a more integrated society, but instead it wasn't done. And then white families build up these assets, and so yeah, we see suburban neighborhoods, black moving in today, but whites just move farther and farther out to these exurban neighborhoods. The classic example of this nationwide is, Ferguson, Missouri, which is almost, where they had the kind of Black Lives Matter movement erupted several years ago, is a suburb of St. Louis, or Prince George's County is a suburb of Washington, D.C. And we still have these kind of replicating segregated spaces all over.
It looks like we have a couple questions in the Q&A. Can you access that, Peter?
Yeah. So all I can access is the chat. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the question and answer, there's a couple things.
Let me see.
There's a question here for Lynda. Did your family face any similar discrimination when they moved to York?
Yes, we did. We moved into a white suburb here also. And it was not as horrific as Levittown, where were riots or anything like that. The neighbors were very nice, always welcoming. But as far as going to school, it was more, how do I want to say this? Cloaked, the prejudice and the racism, but it was there. I found out, and my mother didn't tell me this, when I was chosen to be a foreign exchange student. And the principal and I think the guidance counselor came to my mother's home and said that they didn't think I should do that because I'm not a good reflection of the school. And she said, she's certainly going to do it.
Wow. Yeah, there's a comment here on the Q&A by Kathleen Dellinger. She wanted to let you know, Lynda, that your mother hired her as a substitute secretary at Ferguson Elementary. She never had the privilege to work with her, but she thanks her for her 27-year career in the school district.
Wonderful.
I think there's a great question for you, Lynda in chat. It said Daisy provides such an excellent example of respect for others, and despite the disrespect and abuse she and her family had experienced. Wondering if you could speak to your mother's dedication to treating others with tolerance and respect.
That was just the way both my parents were. They never discussed any kind of differences between people as far as, Spanish or as far Eastern or anything like that. People were people. That's how they discussed it. And my mother worked very hard to make sure that her children received the same respect as anybody else.
One thought I had, because I was trying to, raise the question, why isn't Daisy Myers better known? One of the things I was suggesting is, it's like almost every time we start talking about racism in the North, the backlash comes. And it's interesting. So, the 1619 Project has been viewed by the world as some type of, I don't know, devil's work. Yet it starts off with a question by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's a journalist, and she starts off explaining that her father, who was a black had been in the military, when he was in his teens, 20s, for 40 years, flew a flag outside of his home proudly. And when the flag got tattered, he would put a new flag up there. And so she, is a child growing up and reading about discrimination, wondered, why did her father do this? And she said for years she was almost angry with her father, but she had to, kind of explore why. And she doesn't explore her father, but explores, that makes the argument that blacks in America historically have been the ones who have been, willing to stick their neck out for democracy time and time again in a respectful way. When slavery ended, Southerners were terrified, but there was no revenge. There was no revenge whatsoever. Um, and it was rather quite the contrary. You know, within weeks of the end of the Civil War, the KKK is being formed in the South, and then later on, as history passes, uh, we get this creation of a myth of these vengeful and criminalistic blacks in movies like Birth of a Nation, which were just fiction. And yeah, I just see Daisy Myers as very representative of a lot of black families who instead have to constantly overcome these kind of mythical view of African Americans. And it is sad. And I do think, you know, I applaud the History Society for Center for holding events like this and for seeking to reach out to a more diverse audience in general, because that's one of the things we can do is you know, hold conversations like this.
Thank you. More questions rolling in and comments. One is asking Lynda, where did you go to school in New York?
Dallastown.
I went to Dallas. I went to Dallastown also. And this isn't a question on here, but how was your experience going to Dallastown?
I felt the undercurrent of racism the whole time I was there. And then there were others who welcomed me openly, you know, so it's kind of like how the world is. You have people who will openly love you no matter what you look like. And then there's those who are afraid what you look like. So they, you know, try to intimidate you or make you feel bad about yourself in some way.
I liked one of the other questions for you, Lynda, in Q&A. It says, can Lynda please share how you continue your parents' legacy in your everyday life? I mean, it's kind of a cross to bear, but still.
Well, I try to teach my son to respect everybody also. So he grew up with that. And there's times that things happen that I know are racially motivated, and I have stood up against those things. I've actually lost a job because of that. So and I don't even realize I'm doing it until I'm done. Yeah. So that's kind of how, I guess, you know, that was ingrained in me from them and their example.
You said that your mother told you, or I don't know if she told you, but that she didn't speak about it and didn't write about it until after she retired because she was concerned about kind of paying penalty if she did. That do you think that limited her ability to kind of do everything she wanted to do? Because she still achieved a lot.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think this just expanded her horizon.
And I only ask because the interesting parallel is there's some good biographies that have been written about Rosa Parks recently. So since I made the comparison, and for most Americans, we know Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery. And the rest of her life, she's about this, is just forgotten about. But she actually moved to Detroit, but she was she was forced out of Montgomery. She couldn't. Her husband lost their job. She was pretty much worried about staying in Montgomery. You know, the buses get desegregated, and ends up moving to Detroit. And what sparked my memory of that was that one of the people in chat said that your mother ended up working for Congressman Goodley, and an interesting Rosa Parks ended up working for Congressman John Conyers in Detroit. I mean, so they kind of remain behind the scenes, interested in politics. Maybe Conyers and Goodling were slightly different in their political views, but still they were wanted to be public servants. And Parks did that relatively late. I mean, she had been in I think, Detroit for about 15 years before she did that. But it was, and we tend to think of Rosa Parks as just some tired old woman, which isn't true, and that if there's anything in your mother's book I wish she did more was talk a little bit more about, there's a chapter on her life before Levittown, because I sense that her parents instilled in her a lot of the very important values, and she hints at that. I mean, the very fact that both your father and her were highly educated. I mean, they both went to Hampton and HBCU. Now we're talking about HBCUs again, and also then went on to New York and got graduate education. That's that says something about a determination at a time when there still were a lot of barriers to even getting a decent education for Black people.
Yeah, education was always very important to my mother. She also went on and got another master's degree from Purdue. So she was always learning and growing, always.
There's a nice comment here in the chat about how Mrs. Myers was his guidance counselor at Lincoln and assistant principal at Hannah-Penn, and he's grateful for her kind but assertive manner in which she mentored children of color like himself in dealing with racial issues in school and in the community. Let's see. She'd ask him how he felt about things happening in the neighborhood and encourage them to excel academically and to shine whenever they could. Right.
So Lynda, I talked about your mother. What are your recollections about your father? Because it's really both their stories. It's
Yeah. My father's was more quiet, but he was the backbone of the family. He they both had the same kind of attitude about racism and prejudice. He did a lot of things that were first for a Black person to do, to be in some of his jobs. He was the first Black. He was just a very strong man. That's all. Always supportive.
So what type of first that you can remember in terms of jobs or anything like that?
I'm sorry, repeat
You
that?
said he was the first in some cases himself in terms of
Right.
work and jobs. Do you remember any?
Oh, he was the first engineer at the job he had here in New York. That's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. And if I'm correct, I believe my mother was the first Black administrative person in New York City schools.
Where did your father work, Lynda, when he was an engineer?
York Shipley.
Okay.
I don't believe they're around anymore. I don't know.
It's probably the same Shipley family that has various businesses, my guess.
Probably.
I'm taking notes for the archives. Thank you.
So Steve Snell asked, Daisy was an active member of my overly white church congregation. It's now more diverse now. He asked, how do we address the problem of Sunday morning segregation, which goes on contrary to the most of both faiths? I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about your experience growing up in church and then your own thoughts about ways to increase the integration of America's churches. But just if you have any memories about what churches you attended.
They were predominantly Black churches as we were growing up. But you have to remember this was not that long after desegregation. So, and I think that's why they're still like that today. that's tradition. They grew up in the church like that. That's where the church they're going to go to.
And I found her discussion of religion in her book really telling of, and I said, I thought a parallel King's Letter from Birmingham jail cell, just kind of a disappointment in a lot of the white churches at the time. They weren't openly racist, but nor did they stick their neck out. And then those who did, I mean, one of the reasons why it wasn't really just the religious leaders. There is a discussion of how the people left that church, or they would be replaced by their higher ups. So, it's like anything else. The church leaders, like, they can only go as far as their flock will let them ultimately, but they're supposed to be leaders. That's just your parents stuck their neck out and risked stuff, and maybe we wish more church leaders would take that risk. But particularly in the 60s, I think at least there was a national support, things like the National Council for Churches, which were rallying around civil rights. So, but what happened in Levittown happened all over the place. In a lot of places, new churches formed. People left they began to see those churches as too liberal, not just on civil rights issues, but on other issues as well.
Mhm.
Women's issues. Are there more questions, Nicole?
Sorry. Yes, there are. There's even a comment here from Barry Myers. He asks, can you tell the audience how Mom pretty much anything she touched kind of turned to gold? How she was an awesome mom, played the piano, excellent cook, all the brilliant quotes, etc.
So, Lynda, tell us about your mother as an excellent cook and a piano player then.
She was an excellent cook. I still haven't quite got it to her point. I'm working on it. But, oh yeah, she started a tradition Thanksgiving and Christmas with our family that we would have like a king's feast at both of those meals. 4 or 5 different kinds of meats, all kinds of salad. I mean, it was just too much. Like a buffet. So we did that every Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then one Christmas, I noticed she was really struggling to do all that stuff. And she says, I think I'm gonna have to stop doing this. And I said, well, okay, then I'll start. So now I do that. And even though my family has dwindled from my Barry moving out to Las Vegas, and then I lost my 2 older brothers, I still cook a meal, and then have all the meats, and it's just, and that makes me feel closer to my parents.
Did your extended family, your father's family, join you in holidays, or how did that work out usually? Or
Well, no, most of his family had moved from New York. So I really don't have family here in New York right now, except for my son.
and do you remember your grandparents at all on the other side, your mother's side?
No, not on my, they both passed before I was born. But I do remember my father's father and mother. And they actually did a lot of firsts too. So maybe it was just, we're born into that. I believe my cousin Karen knows the real story, but I believe they were the first Black family that was moved out of the alleys into an avenue in New York. So, I guess it runs in the blood.
That's wonderful. I'm not seeing too much new on here. but some great comments, including one that says, "You are a superb cook, Lynda."
Thank you.
That's from
Your
Landis.
and your cousin Karen just said what you said about moving is correct. So that's, yes, that's interesting. So someone will have to write a new edition called the Frank and Daisy Myers story. I think that's the, yeah, that's pretty clear in the book right from the beginning that they were a team.
Well, and I want to thank you, Lynda, for giving the History Center the opportunity to republish the memoir. So I think it's already been given to the York County Library System, and I'm hoping to get it into as many schools as possible. So thank you for that.
My mother would really like that. Really like that.
I see there was one question about, well, one last one by Marjorie Williams about Jewish family support for the Black community. So clearly in Levittown, that was, they were Jewish, there was Jewish, in the book, Daisy talks about Jewish community and Jewish organizations and Quaker organizations that not only supported the Myers, but if you read some of the scholarship on it, there's not that much, but Tom Zuger wrote a really good article, and he's probably the most famous urban historian in America right now. That there were groups looking to test the waters in Levittown in the first place. It doesn't mean Daisy and Frank Myers were seeking out trouble or anything, but there was a desire to test Levittown out. At the same time, we need to remember the Levitts were Jewish. These real estate builders were Jewish, and there were, Levitt was the model suburban community. There were three of them. There was one on Long Island. There was one in Pennsylvania and one in New Jersey. And I believe the one in Pennsylvania that Daisy's parents, that's right, Lynda's parents moved to, was at the time the single largest suburban community in all of America with roughly 60,000 people. And they showed it could work. And, then it was just replicated. It was, so yes, there were Jewish organizations and Jewish families that did support Black communities, but there were also other Jews who did not. So, I think we need to, just be careful about any group classification for anything. So there is a question, who was the family who sold the home to the Myers? Yeah, it is known. I don't have that name right now. I don't believe it's in your mother's book, but they're one of the articles I cited. If I get it, I'll try to pass it along. My memory is the house had been on the market for a while, and it wasn't necessarily someone who was trying to make a point or anything, and the house had not sold. And the Myers family was willing to pay the original asking price, if not a little higher. So he wasn't an opponent of selling his house to a Black family. But on the other hand, he wasn't necessarily someone who was seeking to sell his home to make that point. So yeah, I think one of the articles I cited, I can try to get that information maybe out somewhere. That's to Anthony, but I don't have it at my fingertips right now.
I actually found that deed signed. I have that. So I don't have it with me, but I can't remember the names either. But I have where it's signed, who sold to and how much and all that. I have that.
And beforehand, I don't want to embarrass anyone. I was encouraging Lynda to give some stuff like that to the York History Center. So at one point they could put together a great exhibit with the book. And then, I've seen something like that deed. I have a fellow former student of mine. We were talking about this after the last panel we were on, and we were talking about racial covenants. And she went home and found her home in York, Pennsylvania. It had one of these old racial covenants. Now it's not legal anymore, but still on the deeds, it still says, you shall not sell to Blacks, Jews, or dogs or something like that, on these deeds. And this was in York, Pennsylvania. These were quite common at the time, as a way of restricting desegregation of neighborhoods.
Yeah, people have history they don't even realize in their attics and files, but it's important to preserve these things so we can move forward. Well, I think we're almost time to wrap up. Dr. Levy, do you want to say a few words to wrap things up?
Well, just that I think we stand on the shoulders of people like Lynda's mother and Lynda's fathers. And, I think to a certain degree, we have a responsibility to carry on the tradition. I have this interesting mural behind me. It's a virtual mural. I had spent some time researching the city of Cambridge, Maryland, which I knew nothing about before I started the research. And so you might be able to make out the figure of Harriet Tubman, and next to her is a woman named Gloria Richardson, who also, kind of like Daisy Myers, is fairly unknown in American history. But I was telling Nicole beforehand that she met with Robert Kennedy. She was on the dais at the March on Washington. And I think it's important that we recognize the efforts people made in the past, but not just treat them as historical artifacts, but as encouraging us to continue to fight the good fight. It's the best way to think about it. And I also just want to thank once again the History Center for publishing the book and holding conversations like this. And once again, Lynda, it's just been wonderful meeting you again. It was more fun in person, but this will have to do. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Lynda, so much for sharing your insights and your family story. It's a great
No
great
problem.
opportunity.
I would like to just thank those who joined this Zoom meeting. I appreciate everything you've done. As far as the comments, I can see some of the comments.
Mhm.
And I also draw my strength and courage from people like you.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Nicole.
Yes, thank
Thank you.
you, both of you, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening.
And for us neophytes, can you tell us is the York History Center's Facebook page? We can just Google that or whatever and
Mhm.
find it. And then there will
Yes.
be a link to the YouTube channel. How do we get to
Yes.
that?
Yes, you can access the video of this program on YouTube. All you have to do is Google YouTube and put in York County History Center, and you'll get the recording of this program and all the programs we've done for the past couple of years. So.
Great, because I know I have some students who want extra credit. Okay. No, they would like to learn about it as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you again, Nicole. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.